The Thunder of Neptune, a story of D-Day. Prologue, spring 1944. The rain hammered against the window of a sealed camp near Portsmouth as Lieutenant James Morrison stared at the map spread before him. 4 weeks now, he and thousands of other soldiers had been confined to these coastal bases, cut off from the outside world, forbidden to leave, forbidden even to write letters home. The isolation was deliberate, necessary. One loose word could doom them all. It was late May 1944, and Morrison knew, as did every man in southern England, that something enormous was coming. The ports bulged with landing craft. The skies thundered with bombers heading east each night. Entire armies had materialized in the gentle countryside, transforming peaceful villages into staging grounds for what would become the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Still studying those beach gradients? Captain Robert Chun appeared beside him, coffee in hand. Chun had seen action in North Africa back in November 1942, had stormed the beaches of Sicily in July 1943, and survived the chaos of the Italian landings that September. He was one of the few in their unit with real combat experience against the Germans. Just trying to memorize every detail, Morrison replied. Omaha Beach, Sector Dog Green, our touchdown point. Chun grimaced. I've been in 3 amphibious assaults, Lieutenant. And I'll tell you this, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Those neat lines on your map, they'll disappear the moment the ramp drops. Morrison looked up at the veteran. Any advice? Keep moving forward, no matter what. The beach is a killing ground. Your only salvation is to get off it as fast as possible. Chun paused, then added more softly, and take care of your men. They'll need you when things go to hell. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, as if nature itself was warning them of what lay ahead. Chapter 1. The Deception. While Morrison and his men prepared in their sealed camps, a very different kind of warfare was being waged across the Channel. In London, a Spanish double agent named one Pugil Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British, was spinning the most elaborate web of lies in intelligence history. Pugil had convinced the Germans that he commanded a network of 27 subagents across Britain. In reality, every single one was fictional, conjured from his imagination. Through these phantom spies, he fed the Wehrmacht a steady diet of misinformation about Allied intentions. The real invasion, he suggested through careful hints and fabricated reports, would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, where France nearly touched England. The deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, was magnificent in its scope. The Allies created entire phantom armies, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and falsified documents. General George Patton, whom the Germans considered the Allies' finest commander, was placed in command of this ghost force. German reconnaissance planes photographing the supposed staging grounds near Dover saw exactly what the Allies wanted them to see: a massive buildup aimed at Pas-de-Calais. Meanwhile, the real invasion force gathered further west, in the ports facing Normandy. The beaches there had been given code names that would echo through history: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. 5 beaches where the fate of Europe would be decided. In Berlin, Hitler studied his maps and reinforced Pas-de-Calais. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces along the Atlantic Wall, suspected the deception but couldn't convince his superiors. The concrete bunkers, the minefields, the obstacles on the beaches, they were formidable but not where they were most needed. The spring of 1944 wore on. In Ireland, transportation connections with Britain were severed. Every possible security leak had to be sealed. The invasion was too important, too massive, too desperately needed. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets had been bleeding for 3 years, begging their Western allies to open a second front. The Mediterranean campaigns had helped North Africa, Sicily, Italy, but they weren't enough. Stalin wanted the real thing, a thrust into the heart of German-occupied Europe. That thrust would come through Normandy. Chapter 2. The Storm. June 1st, 1944. The weather turned foul. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stood in Southwick House, staring at meteorological charts with growing frustration. The invasion had been scheduled for June 5th, with June 6th and 7th as backup dates. But the weather was refusing to cooperate. Storms churned across the channel, bringing high winds and rough seas that would make an amphibious landing suicidal. "We could postpone until later in the month," suggested one of his subordinates. "Wait for better conditions." Eisenhower shook his head. "The tides won't be right again for weeks. The men are already loaded onto the ships. They've been briefed. They know their objectives. If we delay now, how long can we maintain security? How long before someone talks? Before German intelligence pieces it together?" Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, stepped forward. "Sir, I have an update. My team believes there may be a brief window, 36 hours, perhaps, starting the evening of June 5th. The weather should improve just enough." "Just enough." Eisenhower's voice was sharp. "Just enough for what?" "To get our men slaughtered on the beaches." "Just enough to launch the invasion, sir. It won't be ideal conditions, but it will be possible." The room fell silent. More than 3 million men were involved in this operation. American, British, Canadian, French, and soldiers from a dozen other nations. Thousands of ships, thousands of aircraft, all waiting on Eisenhower's decision. If the invasion failed, if the Allies were hurled back into the sea, it could delay the war by years. The Soviets might make a separate peace with Germany. Hitler might perfect his V-weapons, might even develop atomic bombs. Everything hung in the balance. "We go," Eisenhower said finally. June 6th, Operation Overlord is on. As the orders went out, Lieutenant Morrison and his unit were already aboard their transport ship, packed tight with other soldiers, the smell of diesel, fuel, and nervous sweat thick in the air. The ship rocked violently in the storm-tossed channel, and dozens of men were seasick, retching into bags and buckets. "Think of it this way," Chun said, trying to boost morale. "At least the Germans won't expect us in this weather. They'll think we're crazy to come in a storm." "That's because we are crazy," someone muttered. Morrison moved among his men, checking equipment, offering quiet words of encouragement. Most of them were so young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, college students from New England. A few weeks ago, they'd been in training camps. Now they were about to storm Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Outside, through the porthole, Morrison could see other ships in their convoy, gray shapes moving through gray water under gray skies. Somewhere in that armada were his counterparts in the British and Canadian forces, heading for Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. The invasion plan was brilliant in its complexity. Airborne troops would drop inland before dawn, securing bridges and disrupting German reinforcements. Then would come the naval bombardment, thousands of shells pounding the coastal defenses. Finally, the infantry would storm ashore in waves, establishing beachheads that could be expanded into a full-scale front. It was a plan built on lessons learned through blood and failure. The disasters at Dieppe in 1942, the near thing at Salerno, the grinding advance up the Italian peninsula. Every mistake had been studied, every tactic refined. And yet Morrison knew that Chun was right. No plan survived contact with the enemy. Chapter 3. The Night Drop. Sergeant Thomas Kowalski checked his parachute for the 10th time. Around him in the C-47 transport plane, other paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division made their own preparations. They were flying through the stormy night of June 5th to 6th, part of the massive airborne assault that would herald Operation Neptune, the first phase of Overlord. The planes bucked and shuddered in the turbulent air. Some men prayed, others checked weapons, a few tried to sleep. Kowalski stared at the small photograph tucked into his helmet, his wife Mary and their daughter Elizabeth, taken 6 months ago before he'd shipped out. Would he see them again? 5 minutes, the jump master shouted. The paratroopers struggled to their feet, weighed down by 70 pounds of equipment. Kowalski's load included his rifle, ammunition, grenades, a fighting knife, rations, water, medical supplies, and a section of a machine gun that he'd have to find a squad to assemble. The doctrine was simple. Drop behind enemy lines, cause chaos, seize key objectives before the beach landings began. Hook up. They attached their static lines to the overhead cable. The plane's side door opened, and wind roared through the fuselage. Below, Kowalski could see nothing but darkness. They were flying at 500 feet to avoid German radar, too low for comfort, but it would get them on the ground fast. Go, go, go! Kowalski shuffled forward and launched himself into the night. The blast of air hit him like a physical blow, spinning him around. Then his chute deployed with a harsh crack, jerking him upright. He looked around, trying to spot other paratroopers, but the clouds were too thick. He was alone in the darkness, falling toward German-occupied France. The ground rushed up faster than expected. Kowalski hit hard, rolling, already struggling out of his harness. He froze, listening. Gunfire in the distance. Shouting in German. The rattle of a machine gun. Where was he? The fields of Normandy looked identical in the darkness. He pulled out his compass, tried to orient himself, but German anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky, confusing his vision. He heard a rustling in the hedge nearby and raised his rifle. Flash, a voice whispered. Thunder. Kowalski responded with the password, relief flooding through him. Another American paratrooper emerged from the hedgerow. Sergeant, the soldier whispered. Private Daniels, Baker Company. I'm lost as hell. Join the club. Kowalski pulled out his map. We need to find our assembly point. Come on. They moved through the Norman countryside, staying low, avoiding roads. Gradually, they collected other scattered paratroopers. The drop had been chaos. High winds and evasive maneuvers to avoid German flak had scattered the airborne troops across miles of terrain. Units were hopelessly mixed up, but the paratroopers adapted, forming ad hoc squads and moving toward their objectives. By dawn, Kowalski had gathered 12 men, none from his original unit. They'd managed to destroy a German communications post and were now approaching Saint-Mir-Église, a critical crossroads town that was a key objective. Other paratroopers had already seized it in a fierce night battle, and the American flag now flew from the town church, the first French soil liberated on D-Day. As the sky began to lighten in the east, Kowalski heard a new sound, a deep, rolling thunder from the coast. The naval bombardment had begun. The beach landings were starting. Chapter 4, The Steel Storm. Admiral Alan Kirk stood on the bridge of USS Augusta, watching the greatest naval armada in history unleash hell on the Norman coast. More than 5,000 ships had crossed the channel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, landing craft of every size. Now the big guns spoke, hurling shells onto the German fortifications. The battleship USS Texas shuddered as its 14-inch guns fired, each shell weighing over a ton, capable of destroying a concrete bunker with a direct hit. HMS Warspite, a veteran of Jutland in the First World War, added its firepower. Cruisers and destroyers joined the bombardment, creating a curtain of steel and explosive force along the coast. Through his binoculars, Kirk could see the beaches. Omaha, where Morrison and his men would soon land, was partially obscured by smoke and dust from the bombardment. The plan called for the naval guns to suppress the German defenders, destroying their bunkers and artillery positions before the infantry arrived. Intelligence suggested that the defenses were manned by second-rate troops, older men and conscript from occupied territories. The cracked German divisions were supposedly held in reserve, still waiting for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Kirk lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. 0600 hours. The first wave of landing craft should be touching down in 30 minutes. Signal from Omaha Force, a communications officer reported. Landing craft launched and proceeding to shore. Very well. Maintain bombardment until the troops are 500 yards from the beach, then shift fire inland. What Kirk couldn't see from his ship was what Lieutenant Morrison was experiencing in his landing craft. The Higgins boat was crowded with 36 men, packed shoulder to shoulder, the boat pitching wildly in the 4-foot waves. Several men were being sick. Others prayed. A few checked their weapons one final time. Though there was nothing more to check, they'd already checked everything a dozen times. Morrison stood near the front, beside the ramp that would drop when they hit the beach. Through the boat's sides, he could hear the thunder of the naval bombardment, feel the concussive force of the shells passing overhead. The sound was beyond description, like standing inside a thunderstorm that never ended. Captain Chun, in another landing craft 50 yards away, was having his own dark thoughts. He'd stormed beaches before, knew what was coming. The problem with Omaha, he'd realized while studying the maps, was the terrain. The beach was overlooked by 100-foot bluffs, perfect defensive positions. The Germans would have machine guns up there, artillery, mortars. And the beach itself had only a few exit points, narrow ravines where the attacking troops would be channeled. 1 minute, the Navy coxswain shouted. Morrison's landing craft was part of the first wave, scheduled to hit the beach at 0630. Behind them came wave after wave of boats, carrying 16,000 men who would assault Omaha Beach that morning. To the east, similar waves were heading for Gold, Juneau, and Sword. To the west, at Utah Beach, another assault was underway. The landing craft's engine pitch changed as they approached the shore. Through the cacophony of the bombardment, Morrison could now hear a new sound, the sharp crack of German machine guns, the deeper boom of artillery. "Brace for landing," the coxswain screamed. The boat's bottom scraped sand. They were still 100 yards from the beach. The coxswain didn't want to risk getting stuck on the obstacles. Morrison knew what that meant. They have to wade through deep water under fire. "Ramp down. Go, go, go." The ramp dropped, and Morrison charged forward into hell. Chapter 5, Bloody Omaha. The water was chest-deep and shockingly cold. Morrison stumbled forward, trying to keep his rifle above the waves. Around him, men from his boat splashed into the water. Immediately, German machine guns opened fire. The bullets made strange, zipping sounds as they cut through the water. Morrison saw the soldier beside him, Private Johnson, a kid from Ohio, suddenly jerk and fall face forward into the water, blood spreading around him. Another man screamed, clutching his arm. A third simply disappeared beneath the waves, dragged down by his heavy equipment. "Move! Keep moving!" Chen's voice cut through the chaos, though Chun was in a different boat, somewhere in the nightmare around them. Morrison ran, stumbled, waded forward. The beach was still 75 yards away. The water grew shallower, waist-deep, knee-deep. Now, they were completely exposed. The German machine guns had perfect fields of fire, and they were using them. Men fell by the dozens. Some made it to the beach obstacles, wooden stakes, and metal hedgehogs designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, and try to shelter behind them. Others lay in shallow water, wounded or simply paralyzed by fear. A few charged forward toward the seawall at the base of the bluffs, running across 200 yards of open sand. Morrison threw himself behind a metal obstacle, gasping. His radio man had been hit. The radio was destroyed. Half his platoon was gone, dead or wounded in the first minute of the assault. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The naval bombardment was supposed to have destroyed the German defenses. Instead, the bunkers on the bluffs were intact, their machine guns sweeping the beach with murderous precision. A shell exploded nearby, throwing up a geyser of sand. Morrison couldn't tell if it was German artillery or a short-falling naval fire. It didn't matter. Both were deadly. He spotted a group of soldiers huddled behind a knocked-out Sherman tank that had been landed from an earlier wave. The tank was burning, but it provided some cover. "On me," Morrison shouted, though he could barely hear his own voice over the din. "Move to that tank." He sprinted across the beach, expecting every second to feel the impact of a bullet. Somehow he made it, slamming into the sand behind the tank. Other soldiers joined him. Chen was there, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, and a young private whose name Morrison couldn't remember, and Sergeant Williams from Charlie Company. "We're getting slaughtered," Williams gasped. "We need to get off this beach." Chen pointed up at the bluffs. "There's a ravine there. That's our exit. We have to take out that bunker first." He indicated a concrete fortification about halfway up the bluff, its machine guns still firing in steady bursts. "Ow!" Morrison demanded. "We don't have any Bangalore torpedoes left, no mortars." "Then we climb," Chen said flatly. "It's either that or die here on the beach." He was right. Already, Morrison could see that some brave souls were attempting to scale the bluffs, using the rough terrain and craters from the bombardment as cover. A few were making progress, but the German fire was relentless. Morrison looked at the men around him, maybe 15 soldiers, all that remained of two full platoons. They were soaking wet, exhausted, frightened. Some were wounded, but they were alive, and they were soldiers. "Listen up," Morrison said, forcing confidence into his voice. "We're going to take that bunker. Chun, Williams, and I will lead. The rest of you provide covering fire. Shoot at those vision slits, keep their heads down. On my signal." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He simply stood up and ran toward the bluff, zigzagging, hoping that speed and unpredictability would save him. Behind him, rifles cracked as his men laid down suppressing fire. The machine gun in the bunker swung toward him, tracers arcing through the air. A bullet tugged at Morrison's sleeve. Another kicked up sand at his feet. He reached the base of the bluff and started climbing, grabbing at grass and rocks, pulling himself upward. Chun was beside him, then Williams. Other soldiers followed. The bunker was 30 feet above them. Morrison could hear German voices shouting inside. He pulled a grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it toward the bunker's aperture. The throw was short. The grenade bounced off the concrete and exploded harmlessly on the slope. But it made the Germans duck back from their gun. Chun threw the next grenade, his aim better. It went through the firing slit. There was a muffled explosion, screams, then silence. Morrison hauled himself over the lip of the bunker's position. The door was ajar. He kicked it open and went in rifle ready. The interior was a charnel house, 4 German soldiers dead from the grenade, another wounded and trying to surrender. Morrison's mind barely registered it. He was already moving to the machine gun, turning it around. From this position, he had a clear view of the beach below. It was a scene from a nightmare. Bodies littered the sand and floated in the surf. Destroyed landing craft burned at the water's edge. Wounded men crawled toward shelter. But more boats were coming in, wave after wave, and more soldiers were fighting their way across the killing ground. "Get that gun working," Morrison shouted. They could use it to provide covering fire for the men still on the beach. Throughout that terrible morning, scenes like this played out across Omaha Beach. Small groups of soldiers, led by junior officers and NCOs, found the courage to move forward. They cleared bunkers, climbed the bluffs, opened the exit ravines. The assault was supposed to have been over in an hour, with the beach secured and troops moving inland. Instead, it took until noon just to get a precarious foothold. By afternoon, reinforcements were pouring ashore. Engineers blasted gaps through the obstacles. Medics worked frantically to save the wounded. And slowly, inexorably, the American forces expanded their beachhead. The casualties were staggering. More than 2,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing on Omaha Beach that day, nearly 10% of the assault force. But they held. They didn't retreat. They took the beach and began pushing inland. Chapter 6, The Other Beaches. While the drama at Omaha unfolded, the other landing beaches had their own stories. At Utah Beach, the westernmost landing point, things went remarkably well, almost by accident. Strong currents had pushed the landing craft south of their intended target, bringing them ashore at a lightly defended section of coast. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, came ashore with the first wave despite being 56 years old and in poor health. When he realized they'd landed in the wrong place, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from here." The troops pushed inland rapidly, linking up with paratroopers and suffering relatively light casualties. At Gold Beach, British forces faced stiff resistance from German strongpoints, but methodical training and heavy naval support carried them forward. The British 50th Infantry Division fought through the coastal villages, street by street, house by house. By evening, they'd penetrated 6 miles inland and were approaching the city of Bayou. Juno Beach was assigned to the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. The Canadians faced rough seas that delayed their landing and drove them into the rising tide, where German beach obstacles did terrible damage to their landing craft. The fighting was fierce. The Canadians took heavy casualties but pressed forward with grim determination, eventually securing their beachhead and pushing inland. At Sword Beach, the easternmost landing, British forces came ashore under fire from German positions at Wistrium. Commandos led by Lord Lovat fought their way inland to link up with paratroopers who'd seized Pegasus Bridge, a crucial crossing over the Caen Canal. The bridge had been taken in a brilliant glider-borne coup de main operation just after midnight, the first action of D-Day. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops in Normandy. The landings hadn't gone perfectly. Omaha Beach had been a near disaster, and none of the forces had reached their ambitious D-Day objectives. But the crucial fact remained. They were ashore. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's fortress Europe had been cracked open. Chapter 7. The Longest Day. For Lieutenant Morrison, June 6th seemed to last forever. After clearing the bunker, he and his surviving men pushed inland, fighting through the Norman hedgerows, ancient earthen walls covered with dense vegetation that divided the countryside into small fields. Each hedgerow was a potential defensive position, and the Germans used them expertly. By evening, Morrison's unit had advanced barely a mile inland. They'd lost contact with higher command, radios destroyed, runners not getting through. They didn't know if the invasion had succeeded or failed, if reinforcements were coming, or if they'd be driven back into the sea. All they could do was keep fighting. "Dig in here," Chin ordered, pointing to a hedgerow corner that offered some protection. "We'll hold until we get orders." The men began digging foxholes, too exhausted to speak. Morrison counted heads. Of the 36 men who'd been in his landing craft that morning, only 12 remained effective. 10 were dead, 7 wounded and evacuated, and 7 more were missing. And this was typical. Every unit had suffered similar losses. As darkness fell, Morrison sat in his foxhole and tried to write a letter home. His hand was shaking too badly to hold the pen. He'd seen too much today, too much death, too much suffering. Johnson from Ohio, whose brains had been blown out in the water. Martinez from Texas, cut in half by machine gun fire on the beach. Kennedy from Boston, who'd made it all the way to the bluffs before a sniper shot him through the throat. And yet they'd won. Against all odds, against the Atlantic Wall and the Wehrmacht and Hitler's Thousand-Year Reich, they'd won. They'd taken the beach. They were in France, and they weren't leaving. "Lieutenant," Chin's voice broke through his thoughts. "Patrol coming in. They've got news." A runner from battalion headquarters stumbled into their position, guided by one of Morrison's sentries. The man was muddy, exhausted, but grinning. "All 5 beaches secured," he reported. "British and Canadians are pushing toward Caen. We're to advance at first light, link up with the airborne troops, and expand the beachhead. The invasion's on, sir. We're staying." A ragged cheer went up from the men who heard. They'd survived D-Day. Tomorrow they'd fight again, and the day after that, and for weeks and months to come. But tonight they'd won. Across the channel, in England, General Eisenhower sat alone in his office, smoking his 4th pack of cigarettes that day. Preliminary reports were coming in. The invasion had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Particularly at Omaha Beach, where for hours the outcome had hung in the balance. Eisenhower pulled out a piece of paper he'd written earlier, a statement prepared in case the invasion failed. "Our landings have failed, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. They wouldn't need it. Operation Overlord had succeeded. Chapter 8. The Bloody Hedgerows. The Battle of Normandy had only begun. D-Day was just the opening act of a brutal 2-month campaign that would cost both sides tens of thousands of casualties. The bocage, the Norman hedgerow country, proved to be a defender's paradise. Each field was a small fortress, bounded by earth walls 8 feet thick and covered with thorny vegetation. Sunken lanes ran between the fields, providing covered approaches. Villages of stone houses became fortified strongpoints. The Germans, recovering from their initial shock, rushed reinforcements to Normandy. Elite SS panzer divisions, which had been held back waiting for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais, finally received permission to move. But the Allied air forces harassed them constantly, destroying bridges, strafing columns, turning what should have been a day's march into a week-long ordeal. Morrison and his men learned to fight in the bocage through bitter experience. Standard tactics didn't work. Tanks couldn't climb the hedgerows, and infantry advancing across open fields were cut down by machine gun fire. They adapted, learning to work in small teams, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast gaps through the hedgerows, supporting each other with covering fire. Sergeant Kowalski, who'd parachuted in on D-Day, was now fighting alongside Morrison's unit. The airborne troops had been integrated into the line after their scattered drops. Kowalski brought valuable experience in small unit tactics and an unshakable calm under fire. "It's like fighting through a maze," Kowalski observed during a brief rest. "Every field the same, every hedgerow a battle. The Germans know this country. They've had 4 years to prepare." The advance was measured in hundreds of yards per day. Villages that should have fallen in hours took days to capture. The city of Caen, a D-Day objective, didn't fall until July. The town of St. Lo, a vital road junction, became the site of a month-long battle that reduced it to rubble. But the Allies kept pressing forward. Reinforcements poured ashore across the beaches. By the end of June, nearly 1 million men had landed in Normandy. Supplies flowed through the mulberry harbors. Artificial ports towed across the channel and assembled off the invasion beaches. The beachhead expanded slowly but steadily. The Germans fought with desperate skill. Field Marshal Rommel knew that Germany's only hope was to throw the Allies back into the sea before the beachhead became unbreakable. He threw his armor into counterattacks that the Allies barely contained. German Tiger tanks, nearly invulnerable to most Allied weapons, wreaked havoc until they could be destroyed by air strikes or outmaneuvered. On July 17th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British fighters. The field marshal was severely wounded and evacuated to Germany, where he would later be forced to commit suicide for his tangential connection to the plot to assassinate Hitler. His loss was a blow to German morale and effectiveness. By late July, the Allies had finally built up enough strength for a breakout. Operation Cobra, the second phase of the Normandy campaign, was about to begin. Chapter 9, Breakout, July 25, 1944. The largest concentrated bombing attack in support of ground troops ever attempted. Morrison and his men crouched in their foxholes as wave after wave of American bombers appeared overhead. 2,000 heavy bombers and fighter bombers dropped nearly 5,000 tons of explosives on a 5-mile stretch of German lines west of St. Lo. The ground shook like an earthquake. Trees were uprooted. German soldiers went insane from the concussion or were buried alive in their bunkers. Some bombs fell short, killing American troops. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. But the bombing achieved its purpose. It shattered the German defenses and opened a gap. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's First Army surged forward through the gap. Armored columns, led by General George Patton's newly activated Third Army, broke through into open country. After weeks of grinding hedgerow combat, the Americans suddenly had room to maneuver. Patton's tanks raced south and west, cutting across Brittany, then wheeling east toward the heart of France. Morrison's infantry followed behind the armor, mopping up bypassed German units and securing the flanks. The nature of the fighting changed. Instead of brutal, close-quarters combat in the bocage, they now faced scattered resistance from German troops trying to retreat or surrender. "It's like a dam broke," Chin observed as they watched columns of American trucks and tanks rolling past. 2 months of bloody stalemate, and now we're moving so fast the Germans can't stop us. To the east, British and Canadian forces launched their own offensive, Operation Goodwood, aimed at finally capturing Caen and breaking out into the plains beyond. The attack involved the largest British armored force ever committed to a single operation, 3 armored divisions attacking on a narrow front. It made good progress initially, but was eventually contained by German anti-tank defenses. Still, it served its purpose by pinning down German armor that might otherwise have been used against the American breakout. The Germans were now in desperate straits. Hitler, characteristically, refused to authorize a general withdrawal. Instead, he ordered a counterattack aimed at cutting off Patton's advance by driving to the coast at Avranches. It was a fantasy. The Germans no longer had the strength for such an operation. The attack, launched on August 7th, was contained and then defeated. The counterattack did, however, create an opportunity for the Allies. By driving west toward Avranches, the Germans had pushed deeper into a forming pocket. American forces were advancing from the west and south. British and Canadian forces were pressing from the north, and Polish and French units were closing in from the east. The trap was closing around the German 7th Army. Chapter 10. The Falaise Pocket. The village of Falaise gave its name to one of the greatest encirclements in military history. By mid-August, several 100,000 German troops were trapped in a steadily shrinking pocket, hammered by Allied artillery and air power. Morrison's unit was part of the forces closing the trap from the south. They'd advanced so far and so fast that they'd outrun their supply lines. Ammunition was running low, and they were living on captured German rations. But the momentum was too important to lose. Keep pushing, orders came down from division. Don't let them escape. The Germans fought with the desperation of trapped animals. SS units, fanatical to the end, held key positions to allow other troops to escape. Tank battles erupted in the narrow Norman lanes. The roads became choked with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment. The carnage was beyond description. Allied fighter-bombers circled overhead like vultures, diving to strafe any German column that moved. Artillery pounded the pocket day and night. The Germans tried to break out, launching attacks against the weakest points in the Allied ring. Some succeeded. Perhaps a third of the trapped forces managed to escape before the pocket was finally sealed on August 21st. But those who remained were destroyed. 50,000 Germans surrendered. 10 to 15,000 lay dead in the fields and ditches of Normandy. The German 7th Army, which had contested every yard of ground since D-Day, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Morrison walked through the aftermath, stunned by the scale of destruction. Burned-out tanks and trucks stretched for miles. Dead German soldiers lay where they'd fallen. The smell was overpowering: burned flesh, rotting corpses, smoke, and cordite. "I've never seen anything like this," Chin said quietly, his usual composure shaken. "Not in North Africa, not in Sicily or Italy. This is annihilation." Kowalski, the veteran paratrooper, nodded grimly. "The Germans are done in France. They might try to make a stand at the border, but they don't have the strength anymore. We broke them here." The sergeant was right. The destruction of the German forces in the Falaise